Sally McManus, welcome to the program.
Great to be here, David.
Now, you tweeted on Friday that, quote, if the federal government had done the job of getting all the stranded Aussies home by Christmas as promised, there would be no more mutant infectious virus in Australia. Do you really think it's that simple?
I think that there's a clear change last year to this year, and that's the fact that the virus has changed and the fact that it's more infectious. And so that provides or poses bigger threats to our community about it escaping as it has. So clearly there's a difference. And so the more we're bringing in people that have that infectious virus, the greater the risk.
So what are you saying? We should somehow stop people coming in altogether?
No, I was just making the point that if we had have done what the Prime Minister promised, which would get all of the Aussies home by Christmas, we wouldn't have the mutant virus here. That simple point I was making.
We would still have people coming, though. More Aussies who want to come home for compassionate reasons, a dying relative or whatever. As I said before, tennis players being brought in. People would still be crossing the border.
I think the key issue here is the vaccine rollout. The sooner we can get that vaccine to frontline workers, to hotel quarantine workers, to flight attendants, to all the people that are involved in the chain of looking after people who are coming home, the better. Even if it reduces infection by a small amount, that'll make a big difference for a more infectious strain or any strain of the coronavirus. So that's the number one thing that we can do right now to keep us all safe.
Let me ask you about that, because there's some debate amongst employers about the vaccine and whether it should be possible for an employer to say it's mandatory to have the vaccine if you want to work at this site. What do you think, and what's the union movement's approach to this?
Well, the really good thing about our country is from the beginning of this pandemic is we made a decision to take advice from medical experts and to make decisions then based on what medical experts say. So what we say is we should do exactly the same in terms of the vaccine. It should be up to medical experts, not individual employers, not individual people around the place to decide it's mandatory or it's not mandatory. If medical experts say that it should be for certain workers, well, we accept that. We don't think it's a good idea for there to be a divisive debate in our country about whether a vaccine should be taken or not, and that's the best course for us to take, and government should be spending their time building confidence in the vaccine and the vaccine rollout.
Does that mean having some sort of medical authority say, at this meatworks or this hospital, it is mandatory, but at this mine site, it's not mandatory?
That's exactly what happens now. Many people maybe don't know, but nurses, for example, have to get the flu vaccine every year, and other vaccines a lot of medical workers do. People who work in meatworks do too, because there's viruses you can catch from animals. So this is a health problem, and there's people that are experts, and we should be taking advice from them.
But who should employers turn to and unions, I suppose, to get that authoritative advice on that work site?
Well, health experts, they should make orders to say that these particular workers need to take the vaccine for health reasons, and that's the way it should operate. And then we as a community need to accept that advice. If that's what's the right thing to do for our country and for health, that's what we should accept.
Just on the economy at the moment, the Reserve Bank Governor, the Treasury Secretary are all saying the economy's in recovery now, and they seem relatively relaxed about JobKeeper coming to an end next month. What do you think? Should JobKeeper continue as is? Should something else take its place? What should happen at the end of next month?
Well, this is a really, really important decision that the government's going to make, whether to keep JobKeeper or whether not to, and at the moment they're saying they're not. So if you're in Melbourne at the moment, you'd be pretty worried about JobKeeper being removed. If you're in Queensland, North Queensland, where they've been really smashed because they depend on international tourists, obviously higher education sector that was missed out. All of these businesses, as well as manufacturing actually, has still been badly affected because of the coronavirus. So what we say is that JobKeeper should be extended for those businesses that are still affected by the coronavirus. So no fault of their own, they are suffering that downturn. And we say that because that will save jobs. We were part of winning JobKeeper in the first place. We think it's been one of the best decisions our country's made in terms of stopping the unemployment queues and keeping people connected to work.
So any business that's still suffering, do you do another test of turnover or revenue to assess. It doesn't matter if they're just in tourism, could be any business, should keep getting it.
That's right. It's not just tourism, but obviously tourism is badly affected. It's also manufacturing. Parts of manufacturing are as well, and that's shown up in the ABS stats, and that's because they're connected to retail. And so it'd be wrong just to pick one sector. Obviously the aviation sector has also been very, very badly affected and should be supported, but if you just take one sector, you're going to leave out businesses that are also affected by the coronavirus that need support.
And run JobKeeper for another 6 months?
Well, for as long as the pandemic's with us, I think is the right thing to do. Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the vaccine rollout, really, doesn't it?
It does, but in some form or another, international tourism, for example, is not likely to be back on its feet for a very long time.
Well, I think as a country, if you think about far north Queensland in particular, they are really dependent on overseas tourism, more so than the big cities where there's other options. And so I think the idea of continuing to support them and continuing to support parts of aviation and obviously higher education, there's really good arguments for that.
Let's turn to the industrial relations debate. You've been speaking a lot about insecure work, and this is what Labor's policy announcement this week is all about. I suspect a lot of people feel like they're in insecure work, whether they're casuals or gig economy workers or even some permanent employees in a struggling business. How do you define insecure work? Who is an insecure worker?
Well, there's two ways of doing it, and quite often the business and government will point to the number of casual workers, and that's about 25% of the economy. But that's not all there is. There's gig economy workers now. There's labour hire. There's people on fixed term contracts. So you've got to add those people into it, and also there's situations where people might be in part-time work, but employers will flex their hours up and down every single week. So that's an issue too. So anything our governments can do, political parties can do to make jobs more secure is a very good thing for our country.
All right, so we're talking there in those categories you list of 3 or 4 million workers. What is your understanding of what they would get under Labor?
Well, what Labor's announced is addressing all of those different forms of insecure work. It would be a mistake just to focus on one because you're not dealing with the whole problem. Effectively in our country, we've just let the problem of insecure work get away from us. So people on rolling fixed term contracts, that's not a normal thing in the rest of the OECD. There's limits on how many fixed term contracts you can be on before you're offered a permanent job. Labour hire, this situation where people are just disposable, they're used via labour hire, and where they're working next to people who are paid more, same job, same pay, would make sure that employers don't have that economic incentive to, make jobs insecure. Casual workers, we've got to get rid of this whole idea of permanent casual. Like the two words don't fit together. Part of what they've announced is that. And finally, the gig economy. And if we don't address this, it won't be just delivery riders. It will be affected by losing those basic job security rights. It could be any worker where your job can be reduced to tasks.
Okay, but again, what would they get? For a gig economy worker, what would change for them? What security would they suddenly get?
Yeah, so gig economy workers at the moment virtually have no rights. They have less rights than workers in Australia did 100 years ago. So under what Labor's announced, they would get all the basic rights of other workers. So minimum wage, sick pay if they're working regular hours, the right to bargain, those things that are, the basic safety net for everyone.
Gig economy workers would get sick leave under Labor's policy?
Part of what has been announced is the Fair Work Commission would say a sector are employees rather than being their own small business. And once you're an employee, you have a right to all of those conditions. It might be still that they're employed as casuals, or it might be that the company decides, well, we're better off employing them full time. That would just be, as it normally is with everyone else, the same rights.
Okay, but to be clear though, the policy is that the Fair Work Commission, the umpire, would be able to look at that sector and decide what rights they're entitled to. There's no guarantee an Uber driver will get sick leave under Labor.
Look, it's really important that it's done this way, and that's because these big tech companies like Uber around the world have been fighting governments and unions where we've been trying to get rights for people. And what they do is they just change things. They say, okay, you no longer wear a uniform, you no longer, you aren't allowed to, you have to have a second job. They do things just slightly to get around the rules. So this is a way of ensuring that doesn't happen. also a way of making sure that people who are genuinely independent contractors, you know, your plumber out there, that they're not covered by it. If you're genuinely an independent contractor, they shouldn't be covered by these rules. We're talking about the grey area, those big tech companies that have grown rich off the back of exploiting people, that we fix that.
What about the casuals though? Do you think casuals should get sick leave and annual leave and long service leave, as well as the loading they get in lieu of those entitlements, or should it be one or the other? What exactly are you suggesting needs to happen?
A couple of things: that we've got to get rid of this idea that people work regular hours and they do that for years and years and years and they don't get those basic entitlements. They're not casual employees. Unfortunately, what the government's proposing now is to legitimate that. So we shouldn't do that. And then those workers should have a choice of permanency, and if they take that choice, well, then you no longer get the loading, but you do get the security and you do get the entitlements.
So after a year, you should get the choice to be a permanent or a casual?
Well, the government's proposing a year. We would like to see that being a bit less. But
what would you like to see?
Well, 6 months or 9 months we think's fairer. But if it's a year, that's an improvement. That's an improvement.
And then if the employer says no, what happens?
Well, this is part of what the problems with the government's proposed laws.
I'm just asking what you'd like to see.
Oh, we'd like to see them converted. If a worker wants a permanent job, for them to get that permanent job. At the moment, what the government's saying is that employers can have reasonable grounds. That reasonable grounds would be if they just decide they don't want to, and you can't even go to the independent umpire and get that challenge.
So you'd like the law to say after 6 months at one workplace, if you want to be permanent, you have to be made permanent?
No, so long as you're working regular hours. Not if you're a genuine casual. Not if you're working here and there all over the place.
But the employer should be required under law to make you permanent.
Yes, if the job is a permanent ongoing job, you should have permanent ongoing rights.
Now, with all of these things and the idea of making entitlements portable to another workplace and so on, the government, as you know, have suggested at the extreme, if every casual and independent contractor had these entitlements, it would cost business $20 billion. Now, clearly that's an extreme example. It's not going to happen, but there will be some cost to business if they do have to provide these entitlements, right? What is a level of cost that you think business should be able to bear?
Well, it's interesting on this issue of portability of entitlements. This is already happening in the construction industry and in the community sector industries.
For long service leave?
And also for annual leave too. And it's a whole issue of you work one job and then another job and another job, even though you're in the industry. That's the nature of that industry. How are you ever going to get those entitlements? They work very successfully. Employers like it. And the reason why they do is over a period of time, they actually pay less.
Okay, but if you are saying to a business you have to make someone permanent after 6 months and offer them all these leave entitlements, that's going to cost them, isn't it?
No, because the employee would then not get the casual loading.
Okay, so you would lose the casual loading, become permanent, and you think this is a net zero cost to business?
Yes.
And the gig?
I actually think it's a positive for business. When people have certainty in their jobs, when they have that job security, they're more likely to spend. And the thing is about our coronavirus recovery, it's going to be a grassroots recovery. You've got to look after the grassroots. That's working people. That's the 12 million people that are going to be spending in local businesses. If we go about doing what the government's proposing, and that's to reduce wages, that's to make jobs more insecure, we'll spend less. That's not going to be good for the economic recovery.
All right, Sally McManus, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.